Hey, Bobby, just a reminder, I have a question for you afterwards, okay? Okay, thank you. Welcome. We're glad that you're with us for our Wednesday night Bible study. Jeff Miller will be speaking for us tonight, and I believe one more time or two more, two more times. And looking forward to Jeff. We enjoyed having him with us last time on video. We're having him with us live this time, and looking forward to it. Let me mention just a couple of things before we get started. Let me get the one I remember. Keep the Waddells in your prayers. Ron is going to have to go through some more procedures, and so keep them in your prayers. And Don Hefner is having a heart cath tomorrow, and want to remember them in our prayers as well. So let's bow together, and we'll turn our time over to Jeff. Father, we thank you so much for the day you've blessed us with. Thank you for the rain you've given to us, and for the opportunity to open your word together tonight and to look at things that'll be helpful and good for us to know and strengthen us as we strive to follow you. We ask you to be with Jeff as he presents the lesson to us tonight. In a special way, Father, we ask you to be with the Waddells and the Hefners and help them, and with all of those that are recovering from so many different things that have impacted us lately. We ask you to be with each and every one of them. Help us to be attentive listeners tonight, and help us to be obedient servants of yours in everything we do. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
While you were saying that prayer, I think I remembered the other thing that you forgot. You were going to mention something about those books out there, I think. So I'm remembering now, there's books back there, and that my dad left here, I think, last week, so that are available out there for purchase. I really appreciate, my dad already, just from being here last week, he spoke already very highly of this congregation. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and several of you have already asked about my mom and how she's doing. And so I want to go ahead and just tell you from the pulpit what's going on there. So if you didn't know about that she was diagnosed with a brain tumor. We found out in the last, it's been within the last month there. And then she had a spinal tap to figure out what's going on. They found out this week it is benign. So great news. Appreciate your prayers on that. And they're apparently not going to have to remove that. They're going to try some other things to see whether they can help her out and some of the other symptoms and so forth she's having. So appreciate your continued prayers there. Not that she cares about the brain tumor anyway. I didn't stop her at all. She got that spinal tap. She was supposed to be laying horizontal for a period of time, and she was ready to get up and start helping me work on a door on our front of our house. I said, "Mom, come on, lay down. Let's make sure you get all healed up here before you rock and roll." But that's my mom for you. She's going to keep rolling. All right, so going to talk tonight about what's going on in the creation science community. Some very interesting things going on. The Brotherhood is probably, roughly, I would estimate 30 years behind on what's going on out there in the creation science community. We're still talking about ideas and theories and discoveries that are several decades old. So I think it'll be good to help get you up to speed on some of the neat things going on. So AP, Apologetics Press, for our work, we've been in the business of defending New Testament Christianity for like 40 years now or so, if you can believe that. And by far the hallmark subject we've been dealing with is responding to evolution and the threat that is facing, that is causing, it's being an issue to our country. In fact, now 22% of our country now believes in pure naturalistic evolution. So atheistic evolution. 4 out of 10 of our young people, when they leave home, are leaving the church, and half of those are citing evolution and science issues as the reason. The stuff that they were taught in high school and stuff that they're being taught in college that caused them to question the Bible and question the idea of a supernatural being, and instead they're accepting evolution. And so this is dealing with evolution is a major thing we've got to be able to do. We're quickly getting to a point in our country where, sadly, issues like instrumental music, baptism, the one church are going to become less the issue we're dealing with and more fundamental issues like the existence of God, the inspiration of the Bible, the deity of Christ are becoming more the issues our brethren need to be ready to deal with these coming generations. So starting really with my generation and then the millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha is going to be even worse. The question of baptism isn't going to be even it's going to be way down the line an issue that we even need to be ready to deal with. But whenever we go ahead and deal with the basic subject of evolution, what happens in this day and age when we've done our job and dealt with that, the evolutionist responds with, okay, what's a person left with after he's had evolution refuted? Really what he's left with is a void. See, refuting error is crucial. But notice that refuting error doesn't at the same time teach the truth necessarily. It leaves a void that you have to fill with the truth. So it tells you something that is not true, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what is true to fill that void. And so it's up to us to fill that void with the true model of our origins before other false models fill in the gap. So refuting error is pointless if you don't then turn around and provide evidence for the truth and teach the truth. So enter modern creation science whenever you're talking about the physical evidences. So, question, where do we go to get answers whenever we have scientific challenges that are levied against the biblical account of creation and the flood? We're supposed to be ready to give a defense with actual evidence. Test all things, hold fast what is good. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, 1 Peter 3:15. Be ready to give a defense. So where do we turn? Well, you probably turn to Christian evidences organizations that you hope will have answers, that have studied the subjects, and have answers to the quibbles, the challenges being made against biblical creation. Well, who are they turning to get the answers that they need, backed by actual physical evidence? There are what I would describe as a handful of young earth creation scientists that we're really all counting on to step up and try to fill the gap in this area. And so they're getting into the field, doing science and gathering evidence that supports the Bible. And so geologists and paleontologists and biologists, cosmologists, all kinds of guys like that. And they're studying the text of the Bible to extract as many clues as they can to try to sort out what exactly did God say happened, and how does the physical evidence out there fit with that. So they're using modern scientific knowledge to do research and testing to develop a scientific model to explain the universe and all the physical evidence around us from a biblical perspective. And we at AP quote from their materials often. We refer to their work in defending the Bible, but there's not enough of these guys to do what needs to be done. So notice, we can speculate and hypothesize and conjecture all day to try to explain the physical evidence in light of Scripture. We can say, the Grand Canyon, it just must have been carved by the flood. How about, there was just a bunch of water left over from the flood, and it froze up there at the ice caps, and that explains why the woolly mammoths have been captured. We can claim, hey, there was a bunch of water before the flood. It was in a big water bubble, and it popped, and that's where a lot of the water came from. We can speculate and theorize, but guess what? Naturalists can and do the same thing too, with all their speculating and theorizing about the Big Bang and all kinds of stuff. They also make their hypotheses and conjectures to try to explain the physical evidence in light of a naturalistic or atheistic perspective. So how do we refute their specific arguments that they're making, the kind of arguments that are causing our young people to go off? That's causing really the whole country to go off in pursuit of naturalistic thinking. How do we refute their arguments and show how the same physical evidence is actually fit with our perspective? Well, it's going to many times it's going to take actual hands-on field work, research into the kind of questions being asked, gathering proof, physical evidence that supports what we believe. And there are creation scientists doing that kind of work. But several of the leading scientists, frankly, are getting old. They're moving towards retirement, or they're already at retirement, and they're moving on out. And so the field scientists are shorthanded. So what does that mean? Well, it means it affects how much work can be done in this area. It affects how much peer review can be done of that work, which is important because you don't want to have to rely on the work of just, or the opinion of just one individual whenever you're trying to go to battle against these seasoned atheists who in the scientific community usually are backed by many, many scientists. And so you don't want to have to rely on the work of just single individuals. And the fact that they're shorthanded also affects how quickly things can get done in answering the challenges that are being levied against the biblical creation model in this day and age. And another problem we encounter is that these guys are denominational. The leaders in the creation science community are denominational. As far as I've been able to tell, there are very, very few professional, credentialed scientists that are members of the church that can claim to be doing legitimate, firsthand scientific research in the field, helping to prove creation and deal with the quibbles that are being levied against creation. And so really, we're having to count on the field work that's being done by these denominational guys. Now, it's not that we don't have in the Brotherhood people that are studying the work that's being done. That's important to do, and like we at AP and others are doing that as well, and that's important. But notice, historically, that really hasn't been what AP has been about, is getting into the actual field. And so, let's face it, the Brotherhood, by and large, hasn't been out there actually gathering the evidence that will help to defend and build the creation model, and yet we need that kind of information. So when Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, I call him, when he challenged creationists to explain what he claimed were hundreds of thousands of years worth of layering in the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica, we relied on the work of denominational meteorologists that have studied that subject firsthand and know exactly what that evidence is, where they're getting that evidence. When Big Bang cosmologists challenge biblical creationists to explain how you can get starlight that we can see here at Earth, even though it's starlight that is from stars that are billions of light years away, how that could already be to Earth in just a few thousand years, we're relying on denominational creation astronomers, astrophysicists, cosmologists to give an answer to that. Whenever they challenge us to explain the cosmic microwave background radiation, how you can explain, most of us don't even know what that is, but this is a challenge, and it's causing many of our younger people to doubt what the Bible teaches, because our brethren don't even know what this is, and yet it's being talked about in the school system. How do you explain this whenever it is used as evidence for the Big Bang? How can we explain it from a biblical perspective? When geologists challenge creationists to explain the origin of the Grand Canyon from a young Earth perspective, again, we're relying on the work of creation geologists to give us an answer. And again, they are by and large denominational scientists that have done that work and that are answering the challenges. And it's also not the case that we don't have many professional, excellent scientists in the Brotherhood. It's that their jobs don't generally allow them time to be able to do the kind of research I'm talking about. And so they're often busy either doing secular work or they're teaching at our Christian universities where we don't have creation research centers like some of the denominational schools have, and who can have these centers for this kind of work where they can have their top scientists giving them the time, the funding, students to do that kind of work. And this is something I'm actively working on for AP, is raising money for that. In fact, there's a young man that is currently finishing up his geology work. He's going to go on and get a PhD so that we can, Lord willing, hire him to come do this kind of work full time at AP. But you see the problem here. And we got a problem in the Brotherhood for the young Earth position. As far as I can tell, we're doing essentially nothing about this. We're leaving the field work up to others. We're counting on them to do this kind of work, and we're counting on them to fund it while we just sit back and wait And in many cases, we're counting on these denominational scientists to not only gather the information, but interpret that information for us whenever they're gathering this evidence, because we're not going to be able to understand the evidence if they don't interpret it from us, for us, because it's above our pay grade. And so this is a problem that is just going to get bigger and bigger. Some of the interpretations they're putting on the evidence is skewed from a denominational perspective, and it is not how we would view that evidence. And yet again, we're relying on these guys. And so I believe we have a problem here. This is a problem that's just going to be growing larger and larger as science progresses and as many of these more conservative, old school, young earth denominational scientists die out. See, the denominational world of academia is not friendly to the young earth perspective, by and large, even among the more conservative denominations. So the problem is just going to keep getting bigger and bigger, and Christians are going to have fewer and fewer people that we can rely on to give us answers to the most recent challenges. So you see the problem here. Christians need to be ready to stand toe-to-toe with secular scientists in developing and defending the true biblical model. I believe God expects us to be able to do that. Psalm 111:2, the works of the Lord are great, studied by all who have pleasure in them. We're supposed to study the great things, the works that God has done. Psalm 9 and verse 1, I will tell of all your marvelous works. This is something we're supposed to be involved in, the great things God has done. With the heavens that declare the glory of God, Psalm 19:1. We need to study the things that are made that proclaim the existence and even attributes of God. Evidence is so clear that to reject them, notice, is without excuse, Paul said there in Romans 1:20. And again, 1 Peter 3:15, we're all expected to be apologists, defending the biblical model with solid science whenever that's necessary, being ready to give a defense. All right, so with that in mind, over the last few years, AP has been trying to do something about this problem and get the brotherhood more involved in an active way, and I've been able to represent AP with some of these frontline scientists in the creation movement and going into the field and studying some of the things that are going on and seeing how we might be of assistance in this process. So I want to fill you in on some of the things that are going on that I've been able to be involved in. 2014 and 2016, I had the opportunity to go on a couple of geologic field expeditions for several days, traveling up to eastern Wyoming with Dr. Kurt Wise to study what is called the Lance Formation. Kurt Wise is a young earth creation geologist and paleontologist, got his PhD from Harvard under the advisement of the late Stephen Jay Gould. This is probably the most notorious of the paleontologists of the 20th century. Very famous evolutionist. We quote from that guy at AP a lot. So we traveled to the Lance Formation. What in the world is that, and what does it matter? Well, the Lance Formation is several layers of rock that are found in the geologic column, the layers of rock that are below our feet, that many of the creation geologists believe are the layers that are laid down towards the end of the flood. And there is considerable debate over that issue. The formation is found at the top of what is called the Cretaceous system in the geologic column. This is just under what is called the KT boundary or the KPG boundary. This is where your Cretaceous rocks meet up with your what are called the tertiary rock. Okay, so this is the location of some mysterious extinction event that secular geologists believe it happened 65 million years ago using their radiometric dating techniques, which have major issues, but that's what they believe. And whatever this was, this event, it wiped out all of the land dinosaurs. You don't see their fossils above that line, as well as about 75% of all other plant and animal species on the planet. So again, creation scientists believe the Lance Formation are the final layers of the flood that are being laid down towards the end of the flood just a few thousand years ago. So many dinosaur fossils have been found in the Lance Formation, especially in the Lance Creek area where this expedition took place. Your Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, and Tyrannosaurus are typical fossil finds there. We'll talk about that later. Now, the most exciting evidences of the flood that we found were these special layers in the Lance Formation called seismites. And there are quite a few of these layers. more than 25 distinct layers, in fact, that we found there in the Lance. And so from what I can tell, the concept of a seismite is a relatively new idea in the geological community. Geologists haven't even noticed their existence for that long. Seismites form when an earthquake will vibrate a layer of wet sediment like sand. So you picture the kind of sand that is soggy whenever you're maybe along the coast, along the beach or something, and you see that soggy sand under the water line there. So when an earthquake happens, it'll shake that sand. So you picture maybe jumping on some of that sand and picturing what would happen if you did that. If you jump on that sand, it's going to compact and the water is going to start gushing upward. It's going to try to squeeze out of that. And so that happens whenever you see these earthquakes happening. You see that water coming up and escaping. And so if that sand were then to compact and basically cement, so it lithifies, it turns to stone, and then you were to cut that sandstone in two, and you were to look at the inside layers, you would see these squiggly lines like those on the screen. These are convolutions that form from the water being shaken up and being disturbed during this earthquake. And these shapes are called fluid evulsion structures. So whenever you see major earthquakes today, like 1964 Alaska, you had an 8.2 magnitude earthquake, huge earthquake. It'll create seismites in this kind of sediment. And so now that Alaskan earthquake made a seismite that was about 11 inches or so in thickness, and that is typical when geologists will study seismites from these major earthquakes today, just a few inches for these magnitude 9 earthquakes. All right, so we step back and we think, if the flood happened, then we would predict there's going to be seismites in whatever rock layers formed during the flood, because they form when you've got wet sediment and when you have earthquakes, both of which you're going to predict in the flood. You got all the fountains of the great deep breaking up. You got major earthquakes going on. The video I recorded that you all saw, I guess, last summer, I went through and explained what the modern thinking is on what's going on in the flood. So there's a lot of major tectonic activity going on, what creationists call catastrophic plate tectonics. And I don't have time to rehash all of that. But if that's true, that you've got all the fountains of the deep are breaking up, you essentially have the breakup of the ocean floor, you got plates moving around, smashing into each other, forming the mountains rapidly, well, you would predict major seismites to exist in flood sediment, and probably a lot of them. And sure enough, that's exactly what you find in the Lance Formation. But there's a catch. The seismites we're finding in Wyoming were not just a few inches thick. These are several meters thick. These are so huge that there is no modern reference point to understand the magnitude of the earthquakes that would have created these. These are like mega quakes. You picture, again, mountains forming because you've got entire tectonic plates smashing into each other that would send shock waves across the entire continent. So this means, number one, the whole area was once covered with a lot of water, enough to make several meters of soggy sand. And number two, several major earthquakes occurred during the time period that this sediment is being deposited. So these seismites could have only been formed from earthquakes that are so huge that no human has ever experienced them, even knowing his family would have been at this point up on the water and wouldn't have even probably noticed that it was going on. But this is proof of catastrophism like would be predicted if the flood actually happened, and specifically if catastrophic plate tectonics occurred like that I talked about last year. So this is not uniformitarianism, which is what evolution is based on, but this is major catastrophic activity. So how would the naturalistic evolutionists try to respond to this? Well, recall the KT boundary, which crosses the area that we're working in. That's the line above which there are no known dinosaur fossils. So secular scientists believe the dinosaurs died out by something that occurred at that point in history. Again, they would say 65 million years ago or so. And so one theory that's gaining a lot of traction among secular geologists is the idea that a meteorite impact caused that extinction, because you find a massive meteorite crater that was discovered off the coast of Mexico, and it appears to line up precisely with that KT boundary. It's called the Chicxulub crater. And so this was a representation of that meteorite, understanding that it's a secular perspective. And so what we would say is when that meteorite hit, it's probably towards the end of the flood, which means the earth would have likely still had, it would have been covered with water whenever that hit. It hadn't still receded yet. So anyway, they would point to a seismite as proof of the shock wave from the impact of that meteorite. And it no doubt would have left a big impact, but it still, that doesn't fit the facts there at the Lance Formation in Wyoming. And again, you have to get into the field to see that. So for example, the seismites form, remember, in water-drenched sediment, which means the rock layers in Wyoming were underwater when it hit. Now, a tsunami from this meteorite impact would have affected the southeastern states, but not dry land literally thousands of miles away from the meteorite impact. So why was Wyoming covered with an enormous amount of water when this meteorite hit? That's a big question. So it doesn't explain, this crater does not explain the actual evidence in Wyoming. All right, in 2015, I was able to go on a couple creation field trips and was able to bring along one of our interns, summer intern Noah Eisenhower, to help out. And we were able to travel into the Grand Canyon for several days by raft with the leading creation Grand Canyon geologist, Dr. Steve Austin, not the wrestler. All right, this is the guy that the secular guys call the dean of Grand Canyon studies among the creationists. And so we went with him to study the canyon and learn about evidences of the flood and how the Grand Canyon could have been formed from a young earth perspective. I keep looking out there and seeing Mr. Rogers staring at me, and keeps, you notice that, Brother Spivey, when you're preaching, it keeps feeling like I need to wave it. Anyway, so the Grand Canyon is perhaps the most often used evidence of an old earth. This is kind of their go-to. And so they're notorious for using the Grand Canyon to try to prove the Bible is wrong about the age of the earth. And so they'll look, for example, at how long it takes sand particles to build up on desert sand dunes today. And again, that takes actual field work. You got to go out and study that. And they compare that deposition process to the sandstone layers found in and around the Grand Canyon. And they determine that based on how sand deposits today, the rate that happens, and then the thickness of those sandstone layers at the Grand Canyon, it must have taken millions of years for those Grand Canyon layers to form. And they add to that the assumption that in between each of these sediment layers were long periods of time where there wasn't much buildup of sediment, but just instead erosion by rivers and wind and lakes and so forth. Well, again, we're able to go into the field and actually study, does that fit? Or does it, in fact, does the Grand Canyon actually support creation? Well, so for example, in the geologic column, what you find when you go study the evidence out there is there is a distinct line lower in the strata that you can't usually see, like here where we're at here in Alabama, in the normal terrain that we live on. This is a line that sits right above the what we call the Precambrian strata, and it's dated by secular geologists as being 500 million years old. In the Grand Canyon, those Precambrian strata, the strata below that line, are tilted as though they were lifted up by some kind of major activity, and then all of a sudden they're cut off horizontally. There's what's called an erosion surface that cuts those off, and that line extends throughout the Grand Canyon. And then what we find is it actually goes across the whole continent. We find this same line extending for hundreds and hundreds of miles, and then it jumps over the sea and keeps going. Okay, and then right above this line, there is an explosion of fossils in those rock layers. And these fossils are not these little single-celled organisms that evolutionists believe all life started from. No, these are already fully formed and functional, complex species. It totally falsifies evolution. They should not be there. And yet this, to all intents and purposes, is the beginning of the fossil record. And it's called the Cambrian explosion. So this explosion of life, preserved as fossils, it appears at the base of your Cambrian strata. And so we had the opportunity to look at that erosion surface, and you can see it at the Garden of the Gods in Colorado. And it's called the Great Unconformity. And again, it stretches across the planet. And you see this also down at the Grand Canyon. So clearly something significant happened to the Earth at that point in history. It affected the entire Earth, some kind of major erosional event. Well, that line represents what creation geologists overwhelmingly understand to be the beginning of the biblical flood. And here are some of the evidences of that you find in the Grand Canyon that we were able to look at. So you might remember from earth science class back in middle school, this was probably your favorite class in school, right? Earth science. So you got different kinds of rock. You've got your metamorphic and igneous and sedimentary. And sedimentary rocks are generally formed by water processes. Okay, so we can make a prediction about the Grand Canyon, right? We can do actual science. We can make a prediction and say, okay, if the flood formed the rock layers of the Grand Canyon, all that sediment that's piled up in these layers, the layers above that great unconformity in the Grand Canyon should be made of sedimentary rocks, except in those places where maybe you have lava coming up from beneath the great unconformity, creating some pockets of igneous rock from volcanic type activity. Well, sure enough, the layers above the great unconformity in the Grand Canyon are all made of sedimentary rock, exactly as you'd predict. So secular geologists say, well, sedimentary rocks, like sandstone layers, can form from wind, which is what you'd expect in a desert-like environment, like you see out there in the desert of Arizona and so forth. And so they predict that's more the origin of these sandstone layers in the canyon. But we'd counter and make another prediction about the rocks in the Grand Canyon. We predict if a flood covered the earth and formed the layers of the Grand Canyon, we should find in these rock layers fossilized marine creatures, like ocean creatures, that would have been pushed onto the land from the ocean while this is going on, while the flood is going on. All right, well, sure enough, marine shell fossils from ocean creatures are found throughout the Grand Canyon, like the famous nautiloid beds, and they're found oriented in a way that suggests they were buried in a catastrophic process that involved a lot of water that was moving rapidly, not a calm ocean over millions of years as some have suggested. You find sponges out there as well, so again, these kind of marine creatures. Now another evidence, you've got fossilized animal footprints on some of these canyon sandstone layers. Okay, so were they made in a desert environment from creatures walking on dry sand, or are they made on underwater sand, creatures walking on underwater sand during the flood? Well, scientists can study the footprints and figure out what should the footprints look like if it's dry sand versus wet sand. And what they found is there's no doubt these footprints had to have been made by creatures underwater whenever they made these tracks. They're not in a desert environment. So they also studied the difference between sand dunes that form slowly from wind in the desert and the kind of dunes that are formed whenever you have ocean moving water along the base of the ocean transporting sand. These are called sand waves. And you can look at the angle of the sand waves, these sand layers that are formed, that are in, for example, the Grand Canyon. They're about 25 degrees. That doesn't match the angle of the desert dunes that are formed by wind, which are consistently well above 25 degrees, more like 30 to 34 degrees. So instead, they match the typical angle of ocean sand waves, which provides more evidence these canyon layers were formed under water. So other scientists determine if the sand wave is made under deeper water, that sand wave is going to be taller than one made under shallower water. Well, the Grand Canyon has sand waves that are 30 to 60 feet high, And what that means is that the water depth that formed these had to have been 150 to 300 feet deep. All right, so scientists are also able to figure out from those numbers that the water that is forming these sand waves in the Grand Canyon must have been traveling at 3 to 5 feet per second. So this is extremely high speed. Only catastrophic events like tsunamis have been known to be able to create an environment like that. And so we're talking major catastrophic activity involving a lot of water, exactly what we predict is going on during the flood. So the evidence shows that the layers of the Grand Canyon are formed rapidly in the flood. But could there have been a lot of time that passed between each of these rock layers you see out there that could squeeze in more time, as evolutionary geologists argue? Well, let's think about that. So imagine making a cake. So if you were to make a layer of a cake, which I could not do, I will leave it up to my wife. So she makes a layer of cake, and then she puts some icing on there. And then if you were then to immediately make another layer to go on top of the icing, and if you were to look at a profile of that, if presumably, ladies, if you know what you're doing, it should be a straight line, right? You should have a pretty straight line profile between the layers, right? Now let's say you open the kitchen window and you put the cake out on the windowsill to cool while it hardens. I guess this is something you do, right, to a cake? And let's say you accidentally left it there open to the wind as you go out of town for a few weeks. Okay, so what's going to happen to the cake while you're gone? So let's say you come back and now you're going to finish the cake. You guys paying attention? Okay, so now you're going to finish this cake. You hope nobody notices that it's been sitting out there for a few weeks. So whenever you come back, what is now that second layer going to look like before you start adding more to it? Well, some of it, could have decayed, maybe molded. Some of it could have been eaten by insects. If it rained and got the cake wet, there may be even little riverbeds in the cake from the water hitting it and then moving off of it. So if you went ahead and made another layer and put it on top of that second layer, and now you look at a profile, you look at the side of the cake, you would notice that the line between the second and the third layer, it's not smooth. Now you're going to have dips and plunges. You're going to have evidence of erosion and holes. In other words, you're going to find evidence of time passing between those two layers, right? Well, at the Grand Canyon, you can do the same thing. You can look at the lines between the layers and assess whether there's evidence of any time passing between them. What you find is there's no solid evidence that long periods of time pass between the bulk of these layers. There's plenty of evidence there wasn't any appreciable time between many of these layers. They form quickly because the connection between the layers is very smooth. In those places where there is some evidence of some time between layers, it's not necessarily evidence of long periods. The erosion that we see shows that, in those places where there might have been some time, it can be explained as having happened quickly, possibly before the lower eroded layer had even totally lithified. So kind of like what you'd expect if it rained on the cake while it was still a little mushy. So the evidence of time between various layers would likely reveal brief periods of time that elapsed during the flood due to the tide, for example, and how the moon is affecting the surges and waves of the flood, as well as the effects of periodic enormous tsunamis that would have been occurring due to the catastrophic geologic activity going on the base of the ocean. So bottom line, a lot of evidence that the Grand Canyon layers formed quickly during the flood. Okay, so how do we explain the Grand Canyon? Well, it's typical to think, well, okay, how do you explain the Grand Canyon? The flood. And that's not really accurate. Modern creation geologists explain that the strata of the canyon were formed rapidly, apparently in the flood, but the carving probably came later. And so here's the thinking on that. Secular geologists today explain that the floor of the Pacific Ocean, which is like what we call an oceanic plate, it's slowly diving, it's what we call subducting beneath the west coast of the United States, which is a continental plate. And so it's diving down into the mantle. You might remember me talking about that some last summer. As it does that, volcanoes and mountains form. And so there's no problem with that. The major difference between the biblical creation perspective and the secular perspective on that has to do with how fast this is occurring. And so we would say, during the flood, this is occurring on the order of meters per second, this movement, whereas today it's more like centimeters per year. Today the continents move about as fast as your fingernails grow. But during the flood, they're booking it. It's not continental drift. They're sprinting going on. And so this process would have caused large amounts of wet material to be piling up on the west coast. And then areas of the west coast would have been uplifted as that ocean floor is diving under and then pushing up against the continent, kind of like a cork being up underneath the west coast. Well, one area that was likely raised at that time was a huge saucer-shaped area of land that today we call the Colorado Plateau. And this spans 4 states. And the plateau is surrounded by mountains, including your Rocky Mountains and your Kaibab upwarp, and it forms like a saucer. So you've got wet sediment sliding from these places, and it's probably responsible for some of those layers of the Grand Canyon that you see. Interestingly, some of the Grand Canyon layers, the kind of material that makes them up, the source for that material is found hundreds of miles away, like over in the eastern side of the U.S., which shows you've got some kind of major catastrophic event that would be necessary to take that material and transport it all the way west to the Grand Canyon and deposit it out there. All right, so after those layers are deposited and formed, now you got to have something carved through them that'll now create your Grand Canyon. So many secular geologists will argue that they believe in the uniformitarianism. If you've got whatever you see going on today in geology, it always happened that way. And so they would say, hey, the Colorado River is moving down through the Grand Canyon, and so it must have been slowly eroding the Grand Canyon over 70 million years. But years ago, again, you get out there and actually look at the physical evidence. Before Glen Canyon Dam was built that controls the movement of the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, engineers found that the river was carrying 168 million tons of sediment out of the Grand Canyon every year. Okay, so if the Colorado was carving the Grand Canyon over 70 million years, you just do the math, there should be 1.3 cubic miles of sediment that should have been carried to the delta at the end of the river and dumped there. Now that is a volume 1,500 times the volume of the whole Grand Canyon. Okay, it shouldn't be difficult to find such an enormous pile of material, but guess what? That material's not there, which indicates that idea about the Grand Canyon's formation doesn't fit the actual physical evidence there. Creation scientists argue that there was an ice age that would have occurred because of the flood. The flood prompts an ice age that lasted for several hundred years due to warmer oceans, increased evaporation because the oceans are warmer, and volcanic aerosols in the atmosphere that would have partially shielded the earth from sun rays, which would have led to cooler summers and therefore less melting of the ice caps. And so you've got more snowfall, you've got less melting, and so these ice caps built up. And the ice during that period is thought to have formed over an estimated 30% of the dry land today. So then as the earth gradually calms down after the flood, that ice would have started slowly melting, retreating back towards the poles, and leaving these huge icy lakes along the way. So creationists believe at least 3 such lakes were left on the Colorado Plateau, and there is some evidence of these ancient lakes that supports that belief. Now, as would be predicted from the nature of these huge ice age lakes, the natural dams that would have held that water would have breached, because they're kind of these makeshift ocean lakes that would have been forming. They would have breached, and we see evidence of that happening, and I'll show you a couple examples of that in a moment. They breach like dominoes and then release all this water, probably rapidly carving the canyon in just a matter of days, possibly. Well, okay, wait a minute. Is there evidence that water can do that? Can water carve through rock in that kind of way during catastrophic conditions? And sure enough, there are. Here's a few quick examples. 1926, the Burlingame Canyon near Walla Walla, Washington, This is a 30-meter deep, 500-meter long canyon. It was carved in less than 6 days when engineers tried to steer abnormally high amounts of water from a canal into Pine Creek. You can actually still see this using Google Earth. You can see this canyon today. The Lake Missoula flood is a well-documented flood from, believe it or not, the Ice Age, and even the secular geologists acknowledge this. So water during an ice age breached one of these makeshift ice lakes, and it released 500 cubic miles of water. This is 10 times the combined flow of all the rivers in the world, released within 2 days. It destroyed 16,000 square miles of terrain, cut hundreds of feet through solid rock, and created canyons like Dry Falls, which is 20 times the size of Niagara Falls, created cliffs, carved 50 cubic miles of earth. Number 3, this one from the Grand Canyon. This is carving that occurred due to the Colorado River. In June 1983, there was heavy snowfall that caused engineers to divert a lot of water from Glen Canyon into the dam spillways that caused chunks of 3-foot thick steel reinforced concrete to get ripped out of this tunnel from the water moving through there. It took tens of thousands of cubic feet of concrete to fill the holes that had been made. So water has no problem cutting through solid rock if you have a lot of it and you have it moving fast enough. All right, the other field trip I was able to go on in 2015 was back to Wyoming again, to the same area I had studied seismites. This time I was able to study at the feet of the guy that I would say is probably the leading dinosaur fossil expert among the young earth creation geologists. His name is Dr. Art Chadwick, and his team has excavated more than 20,000 dinosaur fossils in this area. Dwayne Bryant, who does some writing for us in the area of archaeology, was able to join us as well on that trip, as well as one of our interns, Noah. Mike Houtz, who's a nuclear engineer at NASA, also does some writing for us about evolution. He was able to join us as well during the beginning of that week. So Dr. Chadwick is a professor at the denominational university down in Texas that's a Seventh-day Adventist university. And again, this highlights the fact that the leaders in the field are not members of the church. And we really need to be pushing to make that happen, and we're trying to do that at AP. So this guy, he teaches geology courses, including a course on dinosaurs and creation. And each summer he brings students up to Wyoming for a month, and they camp out in tents at this site and excavate dinosaur fossils during the day, and then hear lectures on dinosaurs during the evening. And so we were able to come to the site during that time period over the summer for a few days. So as with my trip to Wyoming in studying the seismites, again, we're looking in Cretaceous sediment in the Lance Formation, sediment thought to have been laid down towards the end of the flood. And this is one of the primary spots in the world where you find Triceratops and also T-Rex, Nanotyrannus fossils, Pachycephalosaurus fossils as well. Lots of Edmontosaurus. This is a maxillary of an Edmontosaurus. So the upper jawbone of an Edmontosaurus that I actually was able to excavate while I was there. And Dwayne, Noah, and I were all able to dig up several dinosaur fossils, lots of teeth and tendons and so forth from these dinosaurs. Now, the most exciting goal of this trip was to continue to gather evidence for the flood in regions of the earth where you actually see this late flood, these rock layers actually exposed, which you don't get to see in many cases. And so we're given a glimpse at evidence that could help us to understand what's going on towards the end of the flood, where the dinosaurs are being wiped out in mass. And so that's the big question everyone has. What happens to the dinosaurs here? And so we know the dinosaurs survived the flood because you have archaeological evidence after the flood. And so we got lots of materials that we can talk about that. But the question that we're asking here is, what is going on to the dinosaurs? They're the last creatures being wiped out, apparently, by the flood, at least the last documented creatures. And so that is the question that the creationists are studying at this site. So this is on this ranch that we went to. Dr. Chadwick is again overseeing this excavation. There are 5 different fossil quarries that are actively being excavated, and dozens of dinosaur fossils are being dug up and carefully documented every day while they're there over the summer. So this picture on the screen is one of those fossil quarries where you can see the fossils in the positions they were found in with the dirt removed. So you can see thousands of fossils. This is the quarry I was working in. So the excavation team documents the location of each fossil carefully using GPS. And they take pictures of each fossil, they develop 3D representations of each of these, and then put them back into this picture based on the coordinates they took, so that Dr. Chadwick can get an idea of the big picture of what's going on to these dinosaurs. So there's actually depth to these pictures. You're looking down from above, a bird's eye view, so you're actually seeing multiple layers of layers. Really, you're seeing what I just mean. You see depth to these pictures. Some of these fossils are below other ones. Here's a couple of the other quarries. So based on what's already been excavated over the last few years, and by making estimates over the area concerning what he has still to excavate, he believes that there are over 5,000 dinosaurs represented in this small area where he's already dug up, again, over 20,000 fossils. Now, I don't know about you, but it seems to me like something pretty catastrophic had to happen to wipe these guys out and bury them in this area. Well, the standard secular explanation for what you find says that, okay, these dinosaurs were just dying gradually over time. They tried to cross a river during flood season, and it drowned them and washed their corpses down to a river bend, and they just kind of piled up over time. And so they gradually then got covered up, and that's what you're finding. And so they say that would explain how this occurred is not some massive global catastrophic process. So again, you get into the field and actually study the evidence to see if that fits. Well, there's some major issues that you find. So for one, the bones are not found oriented as you would expect from a river current. They're found randomly oriented. They're not found oriented in a way which you would expect from a river depositing these. So keep in mind, the thousands of bones that are being excavated by Dr. Chadwick and his team are documented with multiple GPS points so that they know exactly where the bones were found and their orientations, and the bones are not found in a current-like orientation. So also the bones aren't found piled as though they're piling up on a river bend. They're randomly distributed all over this entire area. So after you take the sites that he has excavated so far, which continue to grow significantly each year as they dig, and you extrapolate to the areas that he hasn't yet excavated, well, assuming he continues to find what he's finding every year, this is what you find. And also, these bones are what we call disarticulated. That means that the skeleton of the whole intact dinosaur is not found. It's really rare to find a dinosaur where you have the entire shape of the dinosaur. You usually just find individual bones, and they have to try to figure out and piece it back together. But at this site, they're all separated. They're isolated from each other, and really it's worse than that. They're torn to shreds. They're just, into tiny bits and pieces. So if corpses are piling up on a river bend, in order to preserve those bones where they can fossilize, they have to be buried rapidly there. So you would expect at least some of those remains to be articulated, where the bones are found together. You find the actual skeleton, or at least partial skeletons. But again, that's not what we're finding in these quarries. They're all disarticulated. Also, if the dinosaur corpses are being successively piled on top of each other, you'd expect there to be animals in layers, so bone beds on top of each other, representing successive events. Again, that's not what you find when you go look at the evidence. Instead, the dinosaur fossils in this area are in a single, what we call a graded bed, where the larger bones are on the bottom, and then they get smaller as you go up. So this is something that happens where you have a major mudslide carrying a lot of creatures a long distance. It eventually will organize the bones. The heavier bones drop to the bottom in the mudslide as it's moving. So we're talking a single event, a single rapid catastrophic event is responsible for wiping out some 5,000 creatures, tearing them into smithereens and dumping them in this area where we're then digging these bones out. So the model that fits the facts is a single catastrophic deep flood, and such an event would be capable of creating a single graded bone bed, just like the ones these dinosaurs are found in, capable of creating the type and structure of the stones that we see in these dinosaur layers, and capable of causing mudslides that would catastrophically kill and bury some 5,000 dinosaurs and preserve them for fossilization. I mean, just imagine the kind of power required to kill like a Tyrannosaurus Rex, much less to obliterate it into little pieces. And keep in mind that these dinosaurs are in the same rock layers where we find those seismites I was talking about. So you picture these mega earthquakes going on. They are apparently exploding dinosaurs. That's what we're talking about here. And probably it's the Rockies forming. As the Rockies are forming, and you've got these seismites that are almost liquefying these earthquakes that are basically liquefying the surface of the earth because there's so much power, and just obliterating the dinosaurs, killing them, and then you've got these mudslides that bring them and dump them in this area. Pretty powerful stuff. This isn't some slow and gradual uniform process. This is a major catastrophic event, and it fits exactly what we predict if the flood actually happened. All right, let me see if I can really quickly go through one other area. Over the last 4 years, I've been studying caves, and I've gone to 36 so far, and in particular, I'm interested in the solution caves of the U.S., especially those along the Appalachian Mountains and the Ozarks now I'm studying. So caves have long been used as evidence of an old earth, and we're tempted to think that they form from just water flowing underground, eroding rock by the movement of water like a river. But that's not really what the thinking is. Solution caves or karst caves, these are the caves that most of us think of because they make up most of the caves, and they have all the pretty, what we call speleothems, your stalactites and stalagmites and so forth. So those caves have conventionally been argued to have formed slowly as rock dissolves from what we call carbonic acid. This is the stuff that makes your soda fizz. And so the thinking is rainwater, as it's falling to the earth, it picks up carbon dioxide in the air as it falls to the ground, and then as it soaks into the earth, the water seeps through the ground, it picks up more carbon dioxide from all the decaying plants in the dirt, and turns that water into carbonic acid. Okay, so then when that acid sinks in the ground far enough, it'll oftentimes hit a kind of stone that dissolves easily like limestone. And the acid then has to slowly dissolve that rock because carbonic acid is a weak acid, and so it eventually will form an underwater hole. So secular geologists believe that over thousands of years that hole is going to get bigger and it'll eventually form a cave. And then when the water table either lowers or the ground is lifted up due to plate tectonics, that hole will drain of water, and then the erosion on the surface will happen, eventually uncovering the cave. We go down there and see. So as you can imagine, this is a slow process. So it causes Bible believers to start scratching our heads and trying to figure out what's going on here. How do we explain what's going on? Again, you have to be able to get in the field and figure it out. It's easy to say, well, God just must have created all the caves. The problem is that the caves are typically found in the rock layers that are formed not by God on day 3, which are below that great unconformity that I was talking about, but they're found in those rock layers that are start at the great unconformity, the Cambrian explosion, up to the KT boundary. They're found in flood sediment. And so it's also easy to say, okay, well then the flood caused it. But again, it's just as easy for a naturalist to say, the Big Bang did it. The Big Bang created the universe. It's a lot harder to actually gather evidence to prove and substantiate what you're saying. So over the last several years, another kind of cave dissolution process, the process that will dissolve caves, has been discovered and is now being understood to explain how many of these kind of caves have formed. Even the secular geologists are starting to acknowledge this. Instead of rocks being slowly dissolved by carbonic acid from above, they're finding caves can be quickly dissolved from acid coming up from below, stronger acids like sulfuric acid. And so this process of cave formation is called hypogene speleogenesis. So in the case of sulfuric acid, as water comes into contact with rocks that have sulfur, or dead plants and animals which release sulfur as they decay, or the hydrogen sulfide that comes from volcanic activity, if that water combines with oxygen, it forms sulfuric acid. So during the flood, we would expect large amounts of hot water are trapped below the surface of the earth. You got sporadic pockets of oxygen that while this dirt is being piled up on the continents, and then that water would have mixed with the oxygen as well as hydrogen sulfide from all this volcanic activity going on, the sulfur from all the dead plants as organic. So the result is sulfuric acid, and a lot of it. And so the sulfuric acid would have been trapped beneath the Earth's surface, and since it was hot, it would have tended to push upward, in addition to the pressure from above, from the above water and the added dirt on the surface that would have caused that sulfuric acid to squeeze upward towards the surface. It would have dissolved rock along the way. This is called forced flow. So bottom line, the flood conditions would have been perfect for the rapid formation of solution caves by sulfuric acid. Well, again, that's a good theory, but can you gather actual physical evidence that supports the theory and verifies that many of the caves were actually formed in the flood that way instead of over thousands of years from this slow carbonic process? Well, definitely, you can do that. So to show that hypogene speleogenesis explains most solution caves, I'm looking for characteristics in solution caves that would support ascending acid dissolution as the mechanism that formed these. So you're looking for entry holes at the base of a cave for acids to come up. These are called feeders, and then pathways that lead from the feeders to the top of the cave. These are called channels, and then dome structures on the ceiling of caves from the acid pushing upward and then not being able to escape, called cupolas. Well, so without exception, every solution cave that I've studied so far has the characteristics support hypogene speleogenesis. It's exactly what we'd expect if the flood happened and in fact formed these caves only a few thousand years ago. I'm actually going to get to present these results at the Christian Geology Society meeting this summer. Well, what about speleothem growth? Let me talk about this very, very quickly here. So speleothems, again, these are your stalactites, stalagmites, cave bacon, cave pearls, flowstone, and so forth. So these are called secondary features because they form after the cave has already formed. So secular geologists argue, hey, these only grow about 0.01 inches per year. So you get 1 inch every century. And some of these speleothems are so huge, it would take tens of thousands of years for some of these to form. And keep in mind, that's after the cave itself has already been formed. But even if the flood could explain the initial rapid dissolution of these caves, how could all those speleothems grow in just a few thousand years? Well, the answer, of course, is that geologists are assuming, again, uniformitarianism. They're assuming speleothems have always grown at the same rates that we see today. And the problem is uniformitarianism doesn't fit the actual physical evidence when you get out there and look at what's really going on with the speleothem growth. Many factors play a role in how fast these things grow, including the amount of rain that's going on at the surface air temperature, the drip rate, and the concentration of the droplets, the level of carbon dioxide in the soil. So in the years immediately following the flood, during the Ice Age, there would have been much more rain, leading to faster drip rates, much higher levels of carbon dioxide in the soil from the dead plants and animals, which would lead to more calcite in the droplets, and then lower temperatures leading to wider stalagmites. Now, although estimates of flowstone growth are on the order of 0.01 inches per year, the actual empirical evidence, again, doesn't fit that, even today, much less during the Ice Age. Nearly every tour guide in my travels highlighted the fact that they'll give those estimated low growth rates, but then they'll always say, we've actually observed much higher speleothem growth rates in our particular cave. In fact, last week I was at a cave in Missouri, was it in Missouri? No, it was in Arkansas, northeast Arkansas. And sure enough, the tour guide said the same thing. Well, tour guides for Squire Boone Caverns in Mockport, Indiana, for example, showed me a stairwell leading down to the cave, and they know that the stairwell was built in 1973. So it's 46 years from my visit. So at 0.01 inches of growth per year, there should have been about 1/2 of an inch of flowstone in that stairwell. Instead, flowstone covered much of the wall of this 73-step stairwell, and it was 2 to 3 inches thick in several places. So the size of speleothems, not a problem for the young earth position that the Bible teaches. And in coming years, I hope to expand into the northeast and then also moving further west. I'm actually going to be next week checking out a couple in Kentucky, and then I'll be over in Missouri checking out 8 or 9 out there. So hopefully you can see the value of this kind of work. Hopefully it's exciting to you, this idea of getting out there and actually getting the physical evidence to show that, hey, the biblical model, the science supports what we believe. You never have to be concerned about the science. And we appreciate any prayers that you can give us as we do this kind of work, and any kind of support that you'd be interested in helping us in and being able to do this kind of new research that we're doing. If you're interested in doing that, if you're interested in supporting this kind of work, be sure to talk to me so that we can pigeonhole that money for this kind of work in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. I don't remember what I'm doing next time I come back, but I'll see you in a few weeks at that point. I'll pass it over to you. We are dismissed. Very good. Thank you.